Addition and subtraction of vectors. There are two common graphical methods for adding and subtracting vectors, the triangle method and the parallelogram method. Let's begin with the triangle method. Suppose we have two vectors A and B in space. First, draw vector A, then place the tail of vector B at the head of vector A. The resultant vector starts at the tail of A and ends at the head of B. This resultant is called vector C, and it represents the sum of the two vectors. Now, what happens if we reverse the order of calculate? First, draw vector B. Next, place the tail of vector A at the head of vector B. Finally, draw the resultant vector from the tail of B to the head of A. As you can see, the resultant is exactly the same vector C. In other words, B plus A equals A plus B. This demonstrates that vector addition is commutative, meaning that changing the order of the vectors does not change the result. Another widely used method for vector addition is the parallelogram method. Again, consider two vectors A and B. This time, draw both vectors so that they share the same starting point or origin. Now, construct a parallelogram by drawing a line through the head of A parallel to B and another line through the head of B parallel to A. Once the parallelogram is complete, draw its diagonal starting from the common origin. As shown, this diagonal is the resultant vector C, which represents the sum of the two vectors. Now, let's move on to the subtraction of two vectors. Suppose we want to find A minus B. We can rewrite this expression as A plus the opposite of B, or equivalently A plus negative B. In other words, vector subtraction can be performed by converting it into a vector addition problem. Therefore, the first step is to determine the opposite of vector B. To obtain the opposite of a vector, simply keep its magnitude unchanged and reverse its direction by 180 degrees. Now we have the opposite of B. We can proceed with the addition. First, draw vector A, then starting from the head of A, draw the opposite of B. Finally, connect the tail of A to the head of the opposite of B. The resulting vector represents A minus B, which we denote by D. Now, suppose we want to find B minus A. Similarly, we can write B minus A equals B plus negative A. First, construct the opposite of vector A by reversing its direction by 180 degrees. Since B is the first vector in this expression, begin by drawing B. Next, from the head of B, draw the opposite of A. Finally, connect the tail of B to the head of the opposite of A. As you can see, B minus A is simply the opposite of A minus B. Therefore, B minus A equals negative D. Now, suppose we have more than two vectors. The procedure for vector addition or subtraction is exactly the same as it is for two vectors. Let's begin with the addition of three vectors. First, draw the first vector A. From the head of A, draw the second vector B. Since we also need to add C, draw vector C starting from the head of B. Finally, connect the tail of A to the head of C. The resulting vector represents the sum A plus B plus C, which is denoted here by the yellow vector D. Now, consider subtraction example A minus B minus C. In this case, we first replace the subtraction with the addition of opposite vectors. Therefore, we construct the opposite of B and the opposite of C. To find I minus B minus C, begin by drawing vector A. From the head of A, draw the opposite of B. Then, from the head of opposite B, draw the opposite of C, following the expression. Finally, connect the tail of A to the head of the opposite C. The resulting vector represents A minus B minus C, which is labeled here as vector E.